So the next topic we got coming up, gang, is going to be the SARS COVID zoo, whether it was from a lab or from a zoonotical event. Let's bring on your next guy. Okay, hello.
Hello.
You got a camera for us, sir.
Yeah, I'm good.
Hey, tell people who you are, what you do, all that.
Yeah, I'm Deej. I orbit I orbit Wix sometimes, and right now I post on Twitter.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here. Really appreciate you. So today the topic is SARS-CoV-2 almost certainly came from a zoonotic spillover. There is no reason to think it was leaked from a lab. Destiny, give your opening thoughts, and then we'll get into it. Same rules, same thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's basically my opening. I mean, the pattern of infections all spreads from the wet market. We have good epidemiological and genetic evidence to see that it originated from the wet market. There's literally zero evidence whatsoever that it even came from the lab at all. I don't even know how, short of like some insanely secretive plot that nobody knows about, there's literally no explanation for how it could have originated from a lab in Wuhan.
Yeah, go ahead, Deej. Take it away.
So your stance really is that you think that there is no evidence to suggest that it could have stemmed from the lab.
To suggest, there might be a couple things that cut in favor, but generally speaking, no, all the evidence points towards zoonotic spillover.
And how high, when we're looking at the standard of evidence that we have pointing towards it being a zoonotic spillover, how highly do you rate the level of evidence that we have to confirm that that is?
Well, confirm, I don't think we'll ever know, but I'd say 90 to 95%. Basically, it's 100% unless there is there would have to be a whole planned, contrived plot from Chinese operatives to take that virus and then leak it to the wet market on their own without anybody knowing about it, and there's no evidence of it.
So, sorry, I just want to make sure that I understood what you said. So basically, you think that the only way that it could have come from the lab is if China intentionally leaked it from the lab?
Well, took it to the wet market and leaked it, but even that theory would have a lot of problems that would be difficult to contend with.
Okay, and how, I guess, because I'm not gonna get into some of the facts if we agree on these.
Sure.
The virus, do you know how the spillover occurred in the wet market?
I think the theory is that there were two separate spillover events, most likely from the raccoon dog stalls in the southwest portion, I think, of the Wuhan wet market, the Wuhan seafood market.
And why is that the most likely theory?
When you take samples from the area, all of the epidemiological evidence seems to center around stalls that are located in that part of the market. They're the most that test positive for samples that are confirming the SARS-CoV-2 genome, because all of the cases, the very first ones, of the first 5, I think 3 or 4 had direct links to the wet market. The first person I think that they theorized was sick was a wet market worker, and then all of the cases spread out about as you would expect epidemiologically from the wet market.
So, are you suggesting that we know the intermediary host for the
No,
virus?
I don't think we do, but I don't think we need to. We don't know the intermediary host, for instance, for SARS-CoV-1 as well.
That's not true. We know what it is.
We don't know the spillover event for SARS-CoV-1. We absolutely don't.
No, we do.
We don't.
We found that out within 6 months.
We don't.
The intermediate host for SARS-CoV-2 was civet minks.
We don't know that either.
No, we do.
Okay.
Can you
can source me after,
okay.
I guess.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and... do we want to do sourcing on this call?
I mean, I'd be curious because I've never seen that, and I've read a lot of papers on this at this point, so that's pretty crazy. When you say that is the intermediary host, you mean that the spillover event was found, or you mean that this is a host that can facilitate the virus and transfer it to humans?
Yeah, so if you just do a search for SARS-CoV-2 intermediary host, it's going to say an intermediary host is not found. If you do a SARS-1 search for the same terms, you'll find that we do know what the intermediary host for SARS-CoV-1 was.
Can
Oh,
you
okay.
explain
And
Sorry,
that
hold
was
on.
discovered within 6 months.
Can you explain it
Wait,
for
my
the
bad. Hold
audience?
on. Yeah, sorry. Okay. I think you're correct there. I spoke too quickly. What I said is we don't have the spillover event for SARS-CoV-1. We might have, in retrospect, found the intermediary host, but we don't have the exact spillover event for when it occurred.
Correct. And but the intermediary host is, I would say, not trivial, because that is the explanation of how it jumped from the animals into humans. Right now, the only evidence that we have, like going to what you said about them thinking raccoons being a potential vector, is the raccoons were present with the same virus that the humans had, but that was a dead culture of the virus and could have actually just been spread from human to the raccoons.
So it could have been that was initially theorized, but when people go back and they do the tests on these things to figure out where they came from, like in animal stalls where there was the highest concentration of the virus found, it was where there were like these raccoon dogs. It was in the southwest parts of these stalls. In other animal samples where there were no humans present, they found very little or no SARS-CoV-2. And in other stalls where there was more human DNA present, they found more SARS-CoV-2. So the idea that the SARS-CoV-2 was coming from someplace beyond those raccoon dogs, I just haven't seen that. There's no theory or evidence of how it could have come from any other place, and it all seems to point to the raccoon dogs.
Would you say that we have, because one of the main criticisms...
Also, wait, I'm sorry. Can I ask one more question? I'm sorry, 'cause this is actually...
Go ahead.
You're telling me that for SARS-CoV-1, we found a 100% genetic match for nucleotide sequence DNA, or for RNA. We found a 100% sequence match for SARS-CoV-1 in an animal, and also for for the same virus that infected humans, for SARS-CoV-1?
So it's been a little bit since I looked at it, so I don't remember exactly how they determine. What I do know is the confirmed jump from what animals initially had bred the disease in them that made it possible to pass from humans was confirmed to have been that species for
Okay.
SARS-CoV-1.
I would try, okay. I'd be curious to find it because my understanding, in my research, the two closest strands to SARS-CoV-2 were Banal52 and RTG13. These had a 96.8 and a 96.1% match respectively. I thought that the closest nucleotide sequence match, like percentage similarity for SARS-CoV-1 was like 95%. But we can agree to disagree, I guess, on that fact if you want. I don't know if it's necessarily consequential to that, but I was not aware that there was the crossover species and the exact SARS-CoV-1 virus had been identified in an animal species, but I'll look for it later, I guess. But
yeah, I mean, I don't have like I'll be honest, I didn't do new research for this. I'm going based off of back what I was researching in 2023 roughly.
Sure.
So if we want to get down to the scientific names of things, I'm not going to be that strong in that because it's whatever.
I'm curious then, because so I understand that it's possible to try to nibble around the edges for the zoonotic spillover. Can you give me any conceivable theory where it would have gotten from the lab to the wet market where no lab worker was ever shown to be infected and no spread of the virus ever happened from around the lab? And why did it start spreading from the wet market? Can you give me a story that can incorporate those facts?
I don't agree with the facts on that. We know that number one, the lab was kind of under hot water and not investigation, but criticism for poor procedures around leaking the containment. And also there were multiple staff workers who did get sick with symptoms that all we have is that they were sick because China pretty much deleted all the records about what their specific symptoms were. And those individuals did have a connection to the wet market. They did go there. To answer your question,
real quick thing, because we have a factual disagreement here. So my understanding is the serum was available to test for these people for seropositivity for SARS-CoV-2. They were tested later on. Those samples, none of them tested positive for it. And we do know the symptoms for a lot of those sick workers. That I think one guy had a broken arm. A couple had some symptoms that were pneumonia-like, and then one guy had a cold or flu. But they tested all of these later on. None of these people had COVID. And if you would believe that they had COVID, it would have been 2 months before the outbreak. So how can you account for the cryptic transmission where just a couple people were infected, but it didn't have an outbreak anywhere besides the wet market, which is where it eventually outbreak from? Yeah.
So when were those tests on the subjects done, and who was performing them?
The seropositivity tests would I want to say they were done sometime in 2020. But when a lab worker gets sick, you take a blood sample and then you keep it on storage so you can test it later if you need to or whatever. But none of those people
Yeah.
nobody's ever tested positive from any of the lab workers for COVID.
Well,
And even
I mean, a lot of people tested negative for COVID that did still have COVID as well. Like
well, there might have been people who were asymptomatic who didn't go to the hospital, maybe. But for people who were tested,
that's totally plausible as well. They were asymptomatic, went to the wet market, and then spread the disease.
sure.
And
But
then,
what I'm trying to account for is how is it that they got sick at the lab, didn't spread it anywhere else, then got all the way to the wet market, spread it at the wet market, went home, didn't spread it anywhere else, and then it started to all spread from the wet market. How is that possible?
well, there's a pretty simple reason, which is like you're more likely to spread the disease when you're touching and handling things that people are eating. So obviously, if they frequent the wet market, they have the disease, right? Similar
Wait,
to
wait. Frequent the wet market.
Hold on. Because
Let Deej go. Go ahead, Deej.
Okay.
yeah, because if we're gonna say that, well, one person, getting the disease in the hospital, traveling a couple of miles to the wet market and introducing it to the wet market is not likely, how is it likely that the disease would have traveled thousands of miles from the initial reservoir along a whole animal trade in a whole bunch of different cities before getting to Wuhan without any of those places first exhibiting COVID-like symptoms?
Yeah, so that explanation is actually super simple. And the reason is because that animal trade is still illegal and it's done via smuggling in China. So the conditions are pretty dirty, but people try to keep it secret. These are literally things that are being smuggled from the South China Cave area where you're trying not to get caught by officials, and then animals are moving from cage to cage. There might have been workers along that trade route that maybe did get asymptomatic infections, possibly, but it's far more believable to think that somebody that's working in animal smuggling might be either a little more careful or a little more isolated because they know that they're dealing with bad shit and they don't get caught by authorities, versus a guy at a lab got sick and then traveled 12 kilometers to a wet market, only spread it there, went back to his home wherever he lived, and never was a super spreader from any other location. They just super spread at the wet market, where it's not like they're going there and touching everybody else's food and giving it to other people.
Well, but I mean, you could argue all of the cases were linked back to the wet market, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the only place that the spread occurred was at the wet market. It just means that the original source
was the wet market.
So if let's say one of the researchers, right, they come home, they kiss their wife, they spread it to their wife, and then the researcher then goes to the market, or the researcher's wife then goes to the market, it's very likely, in fact highly probable, that the wet market would still be seen as the initial threat vector because it is a circumstance where the disease can propagate more easily.
Why would the disease propagate more easily in a wet market than on a train to the wet market or in any of the number of intermediary stops? Also, I don't even think there's any evidence that links any of the people at the lab to the wet market. But let's assume they did go. Let's assume they went right from the lab right to the wet market. How do they take a 12.1 kilometer journey, however many train stops, train rides, train stations, internal, and don't spread it to a single person? And then at the wet market, they spread it to a ton of people. And then they take the train all the way back, don't spread it to anybody, go home, go back to the lab. How?
Well, they're researchers. Maybe they had a car, right?
So
I mean, you asked, we can quibble over all the potential ways that this could occur, but your stance was there was no way that it could have spread from.
Yeah, because first of all, I don't think because one, we're already on a hypothetical where there's no seropositivity for any of them involved. There's zero evidence that anybody at that lab was infected. Not only is there zero evidence, there's literally pictures of them going out to dinner 3 or 4 or 5 days after the first infection starts showing up at the wet market. So they're sick, they're spreading it to some people at the wet market, but nobody else. They have a car that they drive right to the wet market. There's no evidence of that, by the way, whatsoever, that any of them were traveling to the wet market. They didn't take any public transport anywhere, even though it's insanely common in China. And they didn't spread it to any of their friends. It's so impossible to believe all of those coincidences in a row rather than it came from a wet market. Right?
I would agree with you if China was being transparent, but what was China's initial first response to the disease, and then what was their response even after the initial outbreak and it had spread? And also, I would like to see how you would compare their response to SARS-CoV-2 versus how they responded to SARS-CoV-1.
Well, their first response was to deny it, and now their current response is to say that it came from the United States.
That is one. So they did put out a white paper, and they said that it potentially could have come from the United States, but to pay attention to what the international community and scientists say.
Yep, and all the international community and scientists, all the research, the scientific research is all focused more and more and more on the wet market. Like all of the evidence is continuing to point in that direction.
You're right. Actually, yes, you're 100% right. They all do focus on
No,
what
not
did those
focus as in biased that way. I mean, all of it's pointing in that direction. There is not a single piece of scientific evidence that's pointing in a different direction.
So I heavily disagree with you there because initially, even during the time when China did allow WHO researchers in to look at their curated evidence, it was considered racist and a conspiracy theory among the scientific community to promote the lab leak theory. So kind of this idea when the evidence was hot that they were looking equally into all potential like sources of where it could have come just isn't really true. It was heavily politically biased.
It was heavily biased. I agree.
Against even considering the lab leak.
Incorrect. That's a very American Western perspective. It was against considering China as a source. Because if we want to say that China intervened, I agree with you. That's why we have no live animal samples. Because one of the things that China did is they went to that wet market and they slaughtered and removed every single live animal. The only epidemiological evidence we can point to is the remains and stuff that exist in the sewage drains outside of the stalls. All those animals were slaughtered before they let people into test. And they even removed the characters on the boards that said live animal sales when there were people taking pictures there.
So that makes kind of the claim that there's like the claim that we definitely know like that the disease transferred from, let's say, the raccoon dogs to humans isn't actually that strong because the evidence that would allow the scientific community to make a strong claim for that has been deleted. And that's
it hasn't been deleted. They couldn't know because there's still a ton of evidence in the drains. You could link it back.
Yes, a lot of dead animals that could have literally just had the virus in their DNA in the same way that if I had COVID and got in a car accident, I'd still test positive for COVID.
Yeah, but all of the cases spread from and originate from, and the density all spreads out from the wet market.
Yeah, sure, but that's a lot of it is natural due to the conditions in the wet market, making it a playground for the diseases to spread.
The wet market
that's part of the reason why we criticize wet markets in general.
No, that's not a reason why. The reason why is because they're bringing in animals that are infected with diseases that can likely spill over to humans. There was a researcher that went in 2014 that literally took a picture of the exact stall that the raccoon dogs were kept in and said, this might be a really bad deal in the future, and that's literally the exact same stall where SARS-CoV-2 came from.
Sure, but here's the thing, right?
But wait, but then also real quick, just on that claim, you keep saying that the wet market is an ideal place to spread it from. No, it's not. Wet market was a giant open air, basically, or if it wasn't open air, the ceilings and tents were really, really tall. It probably would spread better in hospitals, which it did. Probably spread better in supermarkets, which it did. Better in malls, in any high density area. I don't know why we would assume that wet markets are the best place for it to start spreading.
Well, I mean, okay, if we're going by U.S. standards of how we handle food, I'd agree. But again, to your point, right? COVID can transmit from a human to an animal and then back into a human. We know that's part of the research that we have done. We know that it can do that, and it did do that, right? People contracting it from their pets or from somebody else's pet. So it's kind of, I don't necessarily want to get bogged down on whether the wet market is an ideal condition or not. COVID could very easily spread in that environment and situation, which is why, whether it was introduced via a bat or whether it was introduced by a human who spread it to an animal, it would spread similarly within those conditions.
I don't disagree with that, but that's why I'd said we would have to have a theory that can account for somebody getting the virus at the lab, taking it over to the wet market, not being infected themselves, and not infecting a single other person in any other area. And we would also have to account for a whole bunch of... I agree. That's why I didn't say 100%, but that's an extraordinary claim. And not only is it extraordinary because we would have to have a whole plot to do that, which would be hard to explain why would you do that, but we would need a whole plot for that to happen. We would also have to explain how did they create a brand new virus using a unique viral backbone, using amino acids that weren't predicted by any known computer model on a virus that all of the research for this had been posted and was being published for so long. How did they do all of this under wraps for so long? There's so many weird scientific things you'd have to account for. It seems way easier to just believe it was probably a zoonotic spillover event, especially given how close the ancestors we found in other South China caves were to the SARS-CoV-2 original leak.
So wait, are you suggesting that it would be more difficult for a black budget research team to force engineer a virus to adopt certain traits when we have a virus that's similar to a virus, then that's less plausible than it naturally evolved from a virus into what was SARS-CoV-2.
Yes. Using a novel backbone that wasn't published or documented by any other researcher? Correct. And then having the amino acids that bind in the cells that weren't predicted by computer models that made it pretty adaptive to humans and allowed it to spread so fast. Yeah, I think that the evidence for it being some black market research thing, there's basically no evidence to support that theory at all. You would have to make a whole bunch of very crazy assumptions.
I mean, if you ask people in the, towards the end of World War II, if the U.S. was developing nuclear weapons, there wouldn't be any evidence to suggest that other than tin pot conspiracy brain stuff.
That's true, but I don't even know how many people knew anything about atomic physics at that point in time. Now we have cell phones, we have labs that are there to study things specifically. We've got tons of epidemiological data. Like, there's tons of reasons why people know things now that aren't necessarily comparable to the Manhattan Project.
So you think that like all the secret research that the U.S. or China does is known to the public, and if we don't have evidence of it, we can't assume that they're doing these things?
No, not all research, but it depends on the type of research you're doing. Like, if you were to tell me that the United States does secret research on like propulsion missile systems that nobody else knows about, that's possible and probably likely. It's something that only the U.S. government can probably fund or do. There's not a high consumer interest in doing it. Like, that makes sense. But if you tell me like the United States government has figured out like a novel way to put together microprocessors in a way that no one else figured out, I would say that's impossible. No shot. There's way too much commercial interest and international interest in this thing in order for some government with a whatever fuck off budget in order to figure that out. It would never happen. So with this particular research, like, this is research the whole world is doing. People are publishing papers on it all the time. The idea that there's some black market budget to figure out this stuff, and then also the lab conditions for that black market are so bad, and it's in a publicly like known about lab, and then they also leak the virus and nobody, like, it's just so many things to believe there. Again, on a novel viral backbone.
I mean, we're talking about China, right? This type of thing isn't really like unique to China when it comes to like secret project leaks and also poor like containment procedures and people following procedures. Like for instance, if I were a Chinese, really anybody in any position, it's historically documented that they inflate and deflate numbers when it is compelling for them, right? Mm-hmm. And also, like, there's a reason we offshored this research to China, but for obviously, like,
well, we didn't offshore
we
it.
Weren't researching
part of
this.
We do research it here as well, but part of the reason why it's in China is because they have a lot of the epidemiological stuff. The origins for a lot of these viruses are from bat populations, like huge bat populations.
So I guess one additional angle I want to tackle is
we got 5 minutes, by the way. Go ahead.
Okay, why do you think China's response to SARS-CoV-2 has been so drastically different from how it was for SARS-CoV-1?
I don't know exactly what the response was for SARS-CoV-1. For SARS-CoV-2, I mean, like, not to be racist, but like eating fucking cats and dogs and having like wet markets and shit for China is a pretty humiliating and embarrassing thing. Like, that's not a proud part of their culture. They have every incentive to cover that up. They tried to in the market.
That was true during the early 2000s as well.
Sure. I don't know about SARS. I don't know the specific steps that China took related to SARS-CoV-1.
Okay, so I'll just explain it then. So China and SARS-CoV-1, basically they did suppress like the initial wave, try to suppress that the disease existed and that, it's just the flu, whatever. But then after a couple of weeks or a couple of months, they were extremely transparent, giving the WHO literally everything that they needed, live samples, etc., to be able to identify the origin of the virus, which is part of the reason why we were able to identify an intermediate host within 6 months. What's interesting, too, is that it actually took longer to find the reservoir of the virus for SARS-CoV-1 than it did for SARS-CoV-2. Despite the fact that China was more transparent, and one...
I would have to... So I don't know how important the fact that we did not find the original crossover for SARS-CoV-1, and we didn't find the original SARS-CoV-1 in any animal population. I would be curious to see where that comes, because my understanding is that's just never the case. I'm looking at this now. I don't think that we ever found that original crossover. I think the closest we got was like less than 94%, maybe. In terms of like when they were looking for it a long time ago, but...
Well, I would venture that bolsters the point I was going to make, which is, why is it that we were able to find the reservoir for SARS-CoV-2 so fast?
Well, I don't think we ever found...
We haven't found SARS-CoV-1.
We didn't find the reservoir for SARS-CoV-2 either. The closest we found...
That's the whole zoonotic spread hinges on the idea that it came from one of these two reservoirs of bats.
Yeah, but you don't necessarily always find the original animal. Like it just doesn't happen all the time.
No, not the original. So with SARS-CoV-2, right? We very quickly found out the original species virus where it kind of incubated, and then from there spread into another animal where it transformed into something that could be spread to humans. With SARS-CoV-1, we very quickly found the animal that spread it to humans, but to your point, we still haven't found the animal that animal contracted it from. And
Sure, but I guess like SARS-CoV-1, didn't that have like 6 or 7 different spillover events before it turned into a pandemic? Like, I just don't know what the comparison is or why.
Well, it was more local. It was more locally contained. It wasn't nearly as infectious, but it was a lot more lethal.
And
which
then
is part
also
of the reason why there was the scare
for SARS-CoV-1.
SARS-CoV-2.
Like, we're not saying that was like a lab leak, are we?
No, we're not saying that. But that's kind of my point. Is if China, like, if we're going to go based off past precedent of what China treating a pandemic level event kind of looks like, their response to SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV-1 are very different. And when you couple that with intelligence agencies, which I think probably have more intel on what China is or was not studying, both Germany and the US, and I believe Australia, find it most plausible that it did come from a lab, suggests to me that
those reports
there's information that we don't know because China destroyed it, that intelligence agencies are aware of, and that SARS-CoV-2 most likely did come from a lab.
So
now, it could have come naturally as well.
Sure. To be fair, real quick, on those intelligence reports, those are low confidence. They admit, number one, and number two, they also introduce some evidence that we know now is just not true. Like the idea that researchers were sick, like in the fall or whatever. It's epidemiologically impossible to assume that virus was infecting people 3 months before an outbreak. We know how SARS-CoV-2 spreads. We've seen it spread in almost every single human population across the globe. At no point is there cryptic transmission for 3 months and then it explodes randomly in a wet market. Yeah. But wait, real quick, because you're going to get the final word, I think, on things, right? So So I'm just like, the argument for zoonotic spillover is that we've already found 97% similarity viruses that are circulating in bat populations in the same caves that we know the wet market stalls were selling animals from. That Huanan seafood market literally had more wet market live animal sales than any other wet market in the entire country. The idea that people went there was an animal that was infected, zoonotic spillover happens there, is easily accounted for in every single piece of evidence. Every single scientific investigation has pointed in that direction. Even though China tried to cover it up in the wet market, they got rid of the figures on the signs. They tried to kill all the animals where they let people go in and test. All of the epidemiological data from the samples tested on the site, all of the epidemiological data from people who got sick and went to the hospital afterwards, all of it points to it originating from the wet market. No researcher was ever shown to be sick with COVID. None of the seropositivity ever occurred in any of those people for COVID. We've seen it spread in the same way across the entire rest of the world. And we've seen the when you break down like the actual analysis of the virus itself, like it's a novel backbone. It's never seen anywhere else in the world. To account for them creating a novel backbone for a virus and then creating an infectious part of it that not only infects humans at a super high rate that was never predicted by any computer models, but also left out some very easy mutations. Like there's the amino acid 614 that goes from D to G or whatever. Like that mutation occurred like in a single generation. This is stuff that if you were creating in a lab, you probably would have already accounted for this because it's so obvious we were trying to make it on the black market. It's so hard to account for all of these individual facts, and all of this also is still off of a conjecture because there's not a single shred of evidence anywhere. The best we can do is make conjecture or a story to say that it came from the lab, and there's just no solid evidence to point that all the evidence points to zoonotic spillover. That's my argument for that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You, Deej, will have the last word. Again, there's a poll in the YouTube chat, so if you guys want to vote on who you think did better, please do so. But go ahead, Deej. Tell people, or again, remind people where they can find you if they want to find you, and give your closing thoughts on this, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Deej Z Nuts with a Z as well, if you want to. I'll say again, it is plausible that the virus could have come from a zoonotic spillover event. Again, very rare chance that it could have occurred. There's a lot of factors as well to get to the point that it spreads in Wuhan that Destiny is glazing over. I think that the reason that we have no evidence for any of the things Destiny brought up is because China did a really good job at deleting and destroying that evidence wherever possible. The only evidence that we really have is things after the fact, as well as the fact that, well, it looks like it could have come naturally, or, well, it's really hard to make a virus that is, like a secret virus that can cause a global pandemic in a lab. It's hard to do that. And, I would agree with that, but that doesn't mean that it is impossible. And it also leads to the credence that, well, that also doesn't prove that it couldn't have come from the lab. The question, well, the way Destiny posed it was, there is no evidence to suggest that it came from the lab. Yeah, sure, there is weak evidence that it came from the lab because like 95% of the evidence that the scientists are using is destroyed. It's one of the main critics that the scientists that are studying this have with the COVID discovery is how opaque China is being on the matter. And so we just don't really have good data. And given the fact that intelligence agencies, which have more data than anyone else really would have, Germany, the US, Australia, believe it is more likely it came from the lab. And even China believes that the virus, who, by the way, China has the most evidence of anyone, believes that it could have come from the US, which, if that were true, would debunk any narrative about it coming from the bats in China, which is kind of the critical linchpin in it being a zoonotic spillover event. So I think it's more likely it came from the lab. I don't think Destiny has proven that it absolutely could not have come from the lab like he claimed in the beginning, but let the votes be what they'll be.
Okay, well, thank you for being here. Gang, you can find him on the YouTube thing. Just check him out. He's a good guy. Having fun so far, sir?
So much fun.
I know, it's great.